Hi, I'm Rohan, and I work as a senior research analyst at Aapti Institute. Aapti is a public research organization based in Bangalore in India, and we mainly look at the intersection of technology and society and study this to understand how interactions with technology can be made more inclusive, more just, and equitable. Um, Today, I'll be presenting submission number 7821, called Safeguarding Societal Value in Migration Management Towards Open Data and Community Centricity. I just want to quickly notify everyone watching this presentation that we have a new title for this presentation and the extended abstract that we have submitted for Data for Policy 2024. It's called Safeguarding Migrant Rights Through Open Digital Ecosystem Principles, a Prerequisite for Deploying Anticipatory Methods. My colleague and co-presenter Amrita Nanda is not available to record with me today as she's had to deal with a family emergency, but she'll be present at the conference that's happening next month, and she'll be there in person to present this with me. But just to quickly get into our presentation and what we're looking at, I'd like to start off by talking about how Aapti views the rights of refugees and migrants in the digital age, our perspectives on how we think digital technology should be governed, and what are some of the leading thoughts that we have when we're looking at data infrastructures and how they're managing, how they're leading to the management of people on the move. So firstly, we'd like to start off by making very clear that we have observed that the role of technologies and the scale of technologies in mediating human mobility and displacement is increasing rapidly. And it's really important to consider what kind of effects this has on people on the move who are forced to interact with these technologies and digital systems. So to start off there, I think it's very important to think about what kind of approaches need to be taken to govern these systems to ensure that people on the move are at the center of negotiating with these technologies. And we believe that a rights-based approach is needed to protect people on the move from various layers of exclusion, discrimination, and harm. Second, we see that data is slowly forming to be a fundamental layer sustaining all these digital interactions. And this is leading to the creation of large-scale data infrastructures. And data infrastructures help those deploying technologies to use these to make decisions about people on the move. So that brings me to my third point, which is that data governance then becomes an essential way in which we can ensure that migrants and refugees are governed ethically, have negotiating power, and are included in decisions made about technologies that are mediating them. So Aapti Institute has been involved in a year-long research initiative to deconstruct this intersectionality of human mobility and data infrastructures. And what we've really done is adopted a mixed methodology to ensure that we cover our bases. First, we started off with secondary desk research, and we quickly moved on to identifying certain real-world cases which we can then use to study further and understand the role that technologies have played in these migration trajectories. From there, we started moving into more primary research where we conducted expert interviews, established partnerships with organizations that have been working in this space for a while, and also got the chance to work on ground, meet people who have migrated and meet them on the sites or in the sites where they're currently present, understand the different technologies that they're mediating with and their perspectives on how they think technology should be designed for their benefit. And finally, we've now arrived at the stage where we're identifying possible solution pathways and recommendations. One of the recommendations is obviously looking at technology design in this space and thinking about how open digital ecosystem principles can be used to better manage migration. Before I get into that, I quickly want to talk about how we're looking at this space. And I think it's clearly established that there's not a single or sole driver for migration, but there are actually multifaceted, intertwined drivers that influence movement. And what this essentially means and essentially does is it has implications for how people on the move are then governed or managed, because you can't just categorize them into migrants, refugees, or asylum seekers. You just have to take people on the move as a category and treat it with a rights-based approach to ensure that all kinds of governance when it comes to technologies and the different digital interactions that people on the move have um, are just, equitable, and provide negotiating power for these communities to ensure that they have agency in their trajectories. So what we then did is move away from looking at drivers of movement to understanding that there are certain linear stages that correspond to migration trajectories. These are crisis, development, and integration. And this categorization is very important for us because we realize that through this conceptualization, we can understand how technology design, how governance and stakeholdership changes as we move from the crisis stage to the integration stage. And our goal is to ensure that people on the move are constantly moving upwards from crisis to integration. Crisis where there's top-down technology implementation to integration where there's established technologies for various use cases, with diverse actors providing these services to meet the needs of people on the move. And most importantly, understanding the governance and the realm of like policymakers and regulators who are involved in this space, and understanding what kind of provisions are necessary to ensure that people on the move have documentation, are legally identified, are included in the receiving country, and have access to legal recourse wherever necessary. So the next part is looking into what we call the 3Ds of migration technology: digital technologies, data assemblages, and decision making. So I'll just go one by one and talk through why we're looking at these 3Ds more carefully and looking at it as what we're currently observing as technological design of migration ecosystems. So the first part is digital technologies. What we've really observed is that the digital ecosystem surrounding migration is not limited to systems built for migration, but other systems like digital identity and digital payments are now slowly seeping into this ecosystem. And this has direct implications on people on the move, because it is not really likely that these systems were primarily built for migration. So how do you ensure that migrants, refugees, and people on the move are then included as categories within these systems? That's problem number one. And problem number two that's related to digital technologies is that these digital systems that would have at first operated in silos or in fragmented manners are now finding ways to operate in clusters. So what's really happening is that we don't have a separate digital identity or a digital payment system, but we're seeing that there is the formation of digital infrastructures. What this means is that there are direct implications on how these digital infrastructures are used to manage people on the move. And I'll get to that shortly. The second is the creation of data assemblages, and this is closely related to the last point I was making, where now that we've established that it's not just singular digital systems, but an infrastructure or a digital infrastructure that's collecting information and data about people on the move. You have large data sets, large databases that are now forming and have the ability to inform decision makers about the kinds of inflows that are happening, the characteristics of the people that are flowing into the country, and the other different aspects that you can gain from the information that's collected through these different digital systems. So what that essentially means is that if you have a digital identity and a digital payments system, for example, once I have sufficient information and data points from the two systems, I can start to actually profile people, start to profile people on the move to understand and identify each migrant based on the data points that have been collected. So again, this has large scale and even dangerous implications on how migrants and people on the move are managed. Within data assemblages itself, there's the traditional data and there's non-traditional data. Non-traditional data is now what we're seeing more of with the increasing digitalization of the migration space. But how traditional data and non-traditional data connect to each other is still unclear. But it is safe to say that in the future, we'll see more and more ways in which these databases and systems will be connected to each other to make decisions about people on the move. Finally, we'll be talking about the different decision makers that are involved in this space. Just to clarify, these digital technologies, assemblages, and decision makers are not an exhaustive list, but just some of the prominent stakeholders and systems that we have observed so far. So whether that's the government, whether it's law enforcement, the private sector, multilaterals, and civil society organizations, all of them have different intentions and impetus when it comes to understanding what information they require about people on the move and the kind of decisions they want to make based on the information they have. So it can be said that the impetus that these stakeholders have largely influence how these different digital technologies and infrastructures are then designed. And the biggest takeaway from this has to be the fact that the people on the move do not really have a say into what kind of technological systems or digital interactions that they are having. They have very little space to influence what kind of design and what kind of decision making happens. And they are left out of this entire nexus between the decision makers and the digital technologies that are deployed. So what we're then looking at is some clear issues that are arising out of how technological systems are designed within the migration space today. And the first one of that is looking at how can these systems be made more considerate of the needs of people on the move, because currently the design of these systems are just determined by the impetus of the decision makers deploying them. Second is intention. Um, so it's very clear that digital technologies are deployed for a wide range of reasons. So whether it's tracking migrants, whether it's anticipating migratory trends, whether it's analyzing migration patterns for security and verification, resource allocation, policy making, whatever it is, how can we actually inform people on the move about why the data collected about them is actually necessary for the stakeholders that are collecting or using this data? Third is migrant agency. Um, We've noticed that digital technologies and data analysis conducted by stakeholders intending to maintain control over mobility have very little consideration or sensitivities towards how can migrants or people on the move actually influence the design and deployment of these systems. So the question really is, how can these be leveraged by people on the move without risk of further exploitation? And finally, and all these points are related to each other, but we're talking about the power imbalance that exists in this ecosystem, where those hoarding data and those who have access to data are clearly the more powerful stakeholders, and data creates these sites of power asymmetry. So how can we move from that kind of design to an ecosystem where digital ecosystems are designed to be more equitable for people on the move? So our basis to really understand this and make these observations have been through some of the case studies that we've looked at. The first one being Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. This is more towards the crisis stage of migration, as I explained before. What we've observed is that this was a case of violent forced displacement, and Rohingya refugees are now stuck in a state humanitarian multilateral paradigm where the state and the multilaterals involved in managing this population are subjecting them to data maximalism, surveillance, and this is also leading to negligible agency for these refugees to negotiate with technologies. One of our observations when we were on ground is that there are 1 million people spread across camps in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, but there are very few multilateral systems that have been able to establish monopolies within the digital networks that are being operated there, whether that's for ID, whether that's for cash assistance, whether that's for food and shelter, whether that's for child protection. All these are managed by powerful multilaterals, which leads to over-collection of refugee data. But crisis response efforts and service provision still remain largely uncoordinated. That's because these multilaterals and organizations deploying technologies use different sets of standards and specifications, and it becomes really difficult to connect these different digital systems and databases. A second difficulty arising from such design is that bottom-up digital efforts that are actually more considerate of Rohingya refugees and their needs are subdued by these multilateral systems and have very little space to then actually input into this digital network. Even though we observe that 80% of Rohingya refugees on ground have a phone and use the internet on a daily basis, they can't really use these for necessities like food, education, health, and so on. Our second case study looks at Nepalese migrants in India. This is now moving from the crisis to the development stage, where there's established digital public infrastructure, a population scale system in India of identity payments and data exchange that Nepalese migrants immediately are plugged into. So this becomes a mediating digital layer to access economic and social institutions when they move from Nepal to India. But what really happens is that there is still a lack of intent to design these systems to allow for social mobility and capital that the Nepalese migrants really aspire for. And what I mean by this is that while the technological design might not be top-down, might be more decentralized and accessible to people on the move, the intentions behind technology design still prevent them from fully realizing the benefits of these digital technologies. So you'll see that unbanked migrants, for example, are unable to navigate systems in the receiving country, which then forces them to actually plug into these systems and not have other ways in which they can actually get used to the newer social and economic fabric that they have moved into. And lastly, we look at a case study of Indian students migrating to Germany for higher education. This has moved from crisis and development more towards integration. Because this is a trajectory that's highly mediated by digital infrastructure that is established, that has been in use for the last 2 decades, and where students actually trust these systems when they're using that for their migration trajectories. So whether we're looking at state and private actors, whether we're looking at higher education institutions, all of these organizations have different digital systems and technologies that they have implemented to help students on this migration trajectory. But what we're really seeing and what we've really observed from different conversations with students is that there is very little information on how their data is being used. And this can be seen in one of the cases where a bunch of foreign students were deported from the country, and identifying them through visa information systems and the education testing score system, a standardized test the students have to give. How these databases were connected were unclear. What that really pointed us towards was understanding that when decision makers want to look for more data to make decisions, these different data points and information is available to them simply because there is large-scale digitalization. So when we're looking at surveillance, when we're looking at how personal data is shared, there's very little information on how this happens, and that remains a major concern. But what all these different case studies tell us is that we need to think about how to redesign these technology ecosystems to ensure that migrants and people on the move are actually benefiting from these technologies and not actually put under more oppression or subject to digital divide that puts them at a disadvantage. So one of our recommendations is then to look at creating open digital ecosystems to safeguard migrant rights. So we can first look at interoperability, which talks about publishing standards and protocols for all the actors and organizations within the digital ecosystem to adopt and comply with. And what this really does is it prevents fragmentation of digital networks. This could mean that, for example, in the case of Rohingya refugees, where there are different multilaterals with their own systems, standards, and specifications, moving them away from that to a um, more consistent set of published standards and protocols would mean that we can actually ensure that data sharing becomes much easier. The navigation of different systems also becomes easier for refugees who are using these systems on ground. Similarly, it creates an environment where bottom-up actors can then plug into these systems because they know that there are certain published standards and protocols that they just need to adhere to participate in this digital network. All of this creates a level playing field for technological innovation service provision and reduces the imbalance in the power structures that are created between multilaterals and people on the move. Similarly, another principle that we can look at is modularity, which looks at using a disaggregated digital stack instead of monolithic technical architecture. And what we mean by this is instead of having a central architecture that defines how data is stored, how digital systems are managed and organized, we move to different building blocks. So we largely end up unbundling the different services that digital systems are providing to people on the ground. And only use digital systems when it is necessary, when it is required, and not burden people on the move with over collection of data, with surveillance, and other sorts of activities that they are usually subject to. So this again helps for more bottom-up contributions, promotes the use of building blocks to connect on a single digital network, making it much easier to not only coordinate, but also ensure that migrants and refugees understand the systems that are being deployed to manage them. So coming to how these principles can actually help with anticipatory methods, it's first important to understand that there are certain conceptual challenges and implementation challenges in adopting anticipatory techniques and executing them on the ground. So the first one is obviously group privacy. Anticipating migration requires a lot of data, and this again subjects migrants, refugees, and people on the move to over collection of data. So really understanding how we can prevent the privacy of people on the move while we're collecting so much data about them. It is important to think about data governance from that aspect. So when we have open published standards and protocols that can be audited externally, it becomes easier to also verify the adherence of these organizations and entities to data protection and compliance. Second issue in the conceptual challenges is the politicization of predictions. So while states, multilaterals, and private actors may collect data for anticipation, they might also use that for other use cases that are political and harmful for people on the move. So one way to prevent this is by using modular technologies or modular architecture, because this disaggregates the technical architecture and ensures that there is no centralization. While there is a universal digital network, each of these different building blocks are owned by different entities or organizations. So this discourages monopolization and ensures that accessing databases and the different information about migrants and people on the move becomes difficult for those who want to use this for political or harmful reasons. So while open public standards allow for interoperability, modularity adds a restriction in terms of ensuring that not one single entity is the owner of the digital network, but there are multiple entities who engage in sharing of data meaningfully and for purposes that are advantageous to people on the move. Now coming to the implementation challenges when it comes to data availability and quality, what we can really ensure is that increased access to databases can be enabled through open standards and protocols. So if there are multiple entities and organizations on ground collecting information about people on the move, there is now a way to seamlessly share data across entities by using these open standards. Second is stakeholder engagement. Again, it becomes much easier to engage different stakeholders from the bottom up or from the top, as long as we can ensure that the architecture remains modular and there is a plug-and-play architecture, as we usually refer to it as, because then you just have a set of standards, you have a set of specifications that you need to adhere to, and then you can build building blocks or digital public goods, which can then be integrated into these networks. So that solves your issue of having low stakeholder engagement. So these are the ways really in which we're seeing open digital ecosystems as potentially providing benefits to how digital migration can be made more equitable and just. And our paper is going to be focusing on all these different aspects. And finally, end by talking about how this open digital ecosystem approach, which has really been reinvigorated by the recent uh, talk about digital public infrastructure, the digital public infrastructure principles of interoperability and modularity. And what we can then really observe is that if we think about technological design in these spaces, we can also start thinking of understanding how migrants and people on the move can co-design these systems, can be consulted while designing these systems, and also have ways in which they can plug into these different architectures once they have been built by organizations that first come in. So we also believe that digital public goods and data stewardship are two other conceptual pillars that are closely related to this and have a role in ensuring that the ODE approach is actually successful in human mobility. But we'll speak about that in more detail in our paper. And finally, we'll highlight some of the limitations of such an approach, where it is essential not just to focus on technological design, but also think about the different political economy considerations that we need to think about, the different stakeholders and their incentives, their intentions, and how to really bring all of this under one umbrella and think about how to actually bring these coordination efforts from their intentions to actually then finally technological design. But I'll end my presentation there, and thank you so much for listening. We really believe that building responsible, resilient, and trustworthy digital systems for human migration is necessary. And we would love to exchange our ideas with people who are interested in this space and want to learn more about our work and exchange ideas. So please feel free to write to amrita@aapti.in or rohan@aapti.in, and we'd be really happy to get back to you. But thank you so much, and I look forward to meeting you all in person.